getting seated, I am Bob McConnell, one of the co-founders of the foundation. This panel will be, what will the support be in the 118th Congress? An interesting question that's being discussed in a lot of different ways. The issues have not been something we've thought about in previous Congresses, but it's now an issue. Our moderator, Ann Compton. Ann was the first woman to cover the White House for a major network. She did that for ABC News for 41 years. Barry Jackson, a Republican strategist with Brownstein, who was the chief of staff for Speaker John Boehner, and assistant to the president for strategic initiatives and external affairs at the White House for President George W. Bush. Michael LaRosa, managing director of Penta, formerly Hamilton Place Strategies. Before joining Penta, Michael served as special assistant to the president and press secretary to First Lady Jill Biden. And before that, he led communications for the House Democratic Policy and Communications Committee. Ann, your panel.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here and for watching. Today's date, obviously December 1st, is an important milestone for Ukraine. But our focus in this hour is going to be looking forward into a crystal ball. What will the new Congress, convening just 34 days from now, mean to continued U.S. support of Ukraine and its democracy? I'm going to start with you, Michael, because you were just on the ground in Ukraine with a very VIP American official.
Yes, good morning. Last spring, when I was still at the White House and I was working for First Lady Jill Biden, the vice president went over to Eastern Europe, and the president had gone over to Poland, and there had been talk about the first lady going at some point. And to her credit, she was asked to go with the president, and she wanted to go when she had purpose, when there's only so much a first lady can do. But she decided not to go on the joint trip and do her own. And she told the staff that she would like to spend Mother's Day weekend with the mothers and families of Ukrainians who had fled and were staying in placement centers and refugee camps in Romania and Slovakia. So that's what we decided to do. And by that point, she and First Lady Zelenska had exchanged about 2 letters since the State of the Union, when our First Lady had showed up in a sunflower dress. And they had exchanged letters through the embassies. And at that point, our embassy had moved to Poland. Mrs. Zelenska, when she heard that we were coming, she suggested a school that our First Lady could visit along the Slovakian border in Ukraine, because the First Lady was very determined to physically go to Ukraine, to her credit. And so our trip was coming together very fast, sort of last minute, which is unusual for a foreign trip. There were a lot of security concerns. There were a lot of people within the administration who did not think she should go because of the security. We'd be going the day before Russian Victory Day, when many expected the war to take on a more violent phase. And it was also a few days after, I believe, a bombing of a school that had been turned into a refugee center where about 60 people had been killed. So there was a lot of concerns from Secret Service and regional security. Nonetheless, we were determined to visit Romania and the refugee centers and thank the government for everything that they were doing for the people of Ukraine. So we moved on and we went to and forgive me, I'm going to butcher the names, but Košice in, I think it would have been Eastern Slovakia. I'm sorry? Yes, yes. Thank you. Apologies. And where we visited a refugee center, the First Lady spoke with many of the families, many of the women, the mothers, and heard their concerns and everything that they've needed. And sort of her main mission was to bring hope. That is sort of what she was trying to do that weekend. But then we drove about 2 hours to the border of Ukraine and at a town called Uzhhorod in Ukraine. And it was there when the First Lady, we visited refugees processing through the border where they would receive basic services. And then at that point, the press who was traveling with us, they weren't necessarily aware that we would be going on further into the country, further into Uzhhorod. And I just remember it was a really sunny day and very warm, very hot. But when we got into the motorcade, which we had to slim down because we had to take a smaller footprint across the border, it started raining and pouring, and it was very dark, and it almost felt like, which is what it was, a war zone. And one of the things that made our Secret Service very nervous, First Ladies rarely travel into war zones. Laura Bush did go to Kabul twice, and even then it was considered a green zone where we had more say over.
I was on that trip.
Yeah, but there was more security that we could control. As you know, this was not our war, and there was no security that we could control anywhere. So it was a little uncertain. So we had to the press, to their credit, they were going to report on the First Lady's trip as soon as we returned back across the border in Slovakia. But when we arrived, we, at the advice of Mrs. Zelenska, went to a school in Uzhhorod that had been turned into a refugee center for displaced Ukrainians, where families were staying, but where there were aid workers who were continuing to teach and educate the the Ukrainian children every day in the same place that they were living and eating and basically in hiding. And that's where our First Lady was going to visit. And then when we got out of the car, our press lined up to capture her, and she walked out with flowers. And then there was somebody getting out of a parallel SUV. And it was the First Lady of Ukraine, who at that point had not been seen in, I think, 4 or 5 months. And she, there were tears, and there was embracing, and it was just a surreal, historic moment to see, because both First Ladies were taking a risk, and we were as concerned about our First Lady as we were, or we were as concerned about the Ukrainian First Lady as we were about ours. She and her children were number 2 on Mr. Putin's kill list. And so we were very aware. And if news were to break while we were there, we were going to have to cut our visit short. But it turned out to be a pretty historic day. And we got back into the car, and she called the president.
It really, really remarkable, because sometimes First Ladies can go quietly into war zones long before a president can. You know, what strikes me, what I want to focus on that is what has happened to what had been and has been very broad support for Ukraine and its embattled government. Barry, have you lost count of how many times you have been to Ukraine?
Yeah.
And how do you explain some of the reluctance we're now seeing?
Yeah, so I think the reluctance may be a bit overplayed.
Really?
I think that, clearly there are members, when we're talking about the House, on the Democratic side, on the Republican side, for different reasons, question our involvement in Ukraine. On the Democratic side, the thing that worries me the most is the Speaker Pelosi not being there. Many of you know her history. She has been a long proponent of freedom and democracy movements and human rights around the world. And her ability to control rogue elements within her caucus, she'll be there, but she'll be very careful about not stepping on Leader Jeffrey's toes. And frankly, we don't know how he's going to handle this. So, but I'm not concerned that there's going to be a mass movement on the Democratic side to run away from
And what
support.
about on the Republican
So on
side?
the Republican side, again, so Leader McCarthy right now is clearly operating under a unique set of circumstances, making sure that he's got the votes to be elected speaker, which I assume is going to happen, but he's got to be careful about how he frames things up. I think that the foreign policy leadership that the Republicans will have, the Intel Committee, Foreign Affairs, the appropriation subcommittee chairs, Foreign Affairs, they're not going to give an inch on this, and they will continue this leadership. But I will say this, and I am a huge proponent of us doing everything possible and more than what we're doing when it comes to Ukraine. But if you've been around Ukrainian politics, and this goes back to the Orange Revolution, there's still big problems in the government. And while people are happy to provide assistance, the accountability side of it can always be improved. So at the end of the day, what I think will end up happening is that whenever the administration proposes an increase in aid or new arms shipments or things like that, the call will not be, well, we're not going to do this. I think there will be more restrictions put on in the sense of more audits, more look-throughs, that type of thing. And the last thing that will be noticeable is that in the year, this year since this latest Putin invasion, the administration's only been up 3 times to do all member briefings. And the Intel community does a great job, DoD does a great job, the members that are on their respective committees. But this movement on both the Democratic side and Republican side of why are we there, a lot of that rests on the administration's shoulders as they've got to make the case. And Ann, you'll recall the last 2 years of the Bush administration were not fun.
No.
And we were bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I can't recall the number of times President Bush or Vice President Cheney, Secretary Gates, Secretary Rice, whenever they had a chance to go in front of the American people and say, we know this sucks, it's treasure in blood, but let me explain to you why it's important that we do this. And frankly, there's so many balls that are being juggled down at the White House right now. I think they've lost that narrative.
That's a fascinating point. Michael, let me ask you, at the other end of the political spectrum, progressive Democrats shocked this city, coming out with an open letter questioning U.S. aid, and then shocked us all again by withdrawing the open letter. What was going on with that?
Well, they immediately withdrew that letter because there was so much blowback from internally within the Democratic caucus from the White House. They recognized, and they actually, many of them came out a couple hours later and basically said, there's a time for diplomacy. This is not the time. President Biden has been very, very clear that we are not going to pressure Mr. Zelensky to come to a table until they defeat the Russians, until they're ready. And we know that the Russians only understand strength, and the Ukrainians are showing that. And so I think the president is resolute, and they received so much blowback, and it was a small handful of members. And what they actually said was they do not want the reasons that they are supporting diplomacy to be conflated with the minority in the Republican conference who want to slow down funding and drag out these spending fights over Ukraine. They were very clear. They did not want to be compared to the other side in what they want. And I think it will be really important. It's very important. I know Senator McConnell, Senator Shelby really want to get this omnibus, hopefully this omnibus pass, the spending package for the end of the year passed. And if it does, it will have a Ukraine supplemental. The president wants to pre-fund next year because we've been given notice by Mr. McCarthy that they want to hold hearings, they want to slow down aid, they want to track the aid and see where it's going. And we should be clear, there are two types of aid. There are weapons, and there is economic and humanitarian assistance. And as Barry said, there are concerned about how that some of that economic aid could be spent. But weapons are, our technology is tracked and checked to make sure that these weapons that we are sending over there do not get into the hands of the Russians or the Iranians or the Chinese, that they can't learn anything from what we are sending. So I believe that there is a lot of accountability that we are holding ourselves to. But I think it's very, very important that we get this omnibus spending package through. Privately, I think Mr. McCarthy would love to get it through as well, so he doesn't have to have these fights next year. And I think McConnell and the president would be in favor of that.
This must be fascinating to both of you because both of you worked inside the workings of the Speaker's office, to Republican, Democrat. So you've seen up close what happens when the leader of the dominant party has to deal with things. Why do you think this kind of opposition has emerged now? Do you are people are members of Congress? Was it the election that had them worried, Michael?
Well, and Barry, you can tell me if this is overly cynical. Look, our effort in helping the Ukrainians has been a point of pride for the president, for the White House. They are so proud that they've been able to bring Europe together to put in place tough export controls on Russia, on finding new energy resources in Europe, so that we can push the Russians back and win this war, and keep our allies and hold them together. This has been such a point of pride. There are cynical elements on our side that believe that that Republicans won't want the president to succeed, because if the Ukrainians are able to win this war, it will be in no small part because of President Biden's leadership. And we've seen the Republicans in previous Congresses hold our economy hostage and bring down our credit rating. We saw what they're willing to do for politics, and there are slight concerns on our side that they do not want to see the President Biden succeed.
Barry, your perspective on this?
When Boehner was Speaker, Harry Reid was his counterpart over in the Senate, and Senator Reid's chief of staff and I had a wonderful working relationship because our two bosses told us, it's your job to make this place work. And it is not possible to be overly cynical about anything that goes on Capitol Hill, number one.
You can quote.
But we had an agreement, and I am sure that this will evolve as McCarthy becomes a bigger face than he is now when he becomes Speaker, is that I would go over to Reid's office and say, hey, Boehner's going to kick your boss in the kneecaps today, we have to do that, but our deal is still on whatever piece of legislation we're working on. So I think, that's how this is going to play out. One of the good things is that now the Republicans will be in control of the House. The White House will have to pay more attention to the Hill, in the sense that, set aside whatever crazy oversight stuff's going to be going on, but the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Kay Granger, knows Ukraine policy inside out. She's always been a strong proponent of democratization efforts. Michael McCall, probably the strongest voice. They're going to call the administration up a lot and say, help us help you. You need to be more vocal. You need to be more thoughtful about when you go out, what you say, how you say it. When you put forward a request for whether it's humanitarian assistance or further weaponry, you need to come up and we're not trying to make it difficult for you, but tell us why this, why now. And what you will find, and I think this is across the board, both chambers, both parties, is more and more of the questions going to be, and what is Europe doing?
Interesting.
Because there is, so you think about when President Obama was first dealing with this situation, and there was this note of, sometimes you can lead from behind. And I think President Biden did a good job of this, because if the United States had said, we're all in, what would the Germans have done? What would the French have done? What would the Brits have done? They had to commit first. And so I say this because the administration is now going to have to keep the pressure on Europe to be able to answer the questions that both Democrats and Republicans will have on the Hill. What's everybody else doing?
And the French president is arriving at this hour over on the White House lawn, and he's going to be a very important voice here. Now that the midterm elections are for the most part over, I want to focus a little bit on the new members coming in, the new House and Senate, and how narrow the balance of power is in each chamber. How do you, to both of you, how can we gauge the impact of this new lineup and the new members coming in? Barry?
Yeah, so both the Democratic caucus and the Republican conference go out of their way to brief new members, not just their respective committees, but here's how we deal with foreign policy stuff. Here's how we do with security stuff. Here's how we do with the economic stuff. And then outside organizations will do these briefings. So like this foundation can trot up to the Hill and, and do it in partnership with the Ukrainian embassy or just on their own, make those calls. Don't forget the staff. It's crazy, but staff matter.
The committee and the
personal
office
offices.
Staffs,
Yeah. I know Senator Portman's going to be here for lunch, and he's obviously been a strong leader, and he's got a guy following in his footsteps that surprisingly to most of us did not understand who the Futes were in Cleveland. And, he learned that really quick. And there's a, fairly significant Ukrainian population in Ohio. Doesn't mean he's going to change his mind, but I think he'll be one of those guys that are going to be asking the questions. Explain why we're doing this. What are we doing to make sure it's spent the way it's supposed to be spent? And how is that impacting our own national interest?
Michael, in your talking to people on the Hill, does Ukraine become a factor in the kind of leadership positioning going on now? We think we know who the speaker is going to be. The Democrats have chosen their leader, but in terms of leadership struggles and positioning and committee chairs, which are very important. Thanks for raising that, Barry.
Yeah.
Do you think that the new membership and the new lineups is going to have significance?
I don't. I think that they should have learned from the event with the letter over the summer, how much blowback they received. I think that's going to be a lesson for new members. I think that the leadership team, while younger, more diverse, somebody said yesterday the three of them equal one Nancy Pelosi, and maybe that's a good thing. But I think that they are going to be very deferential to the administration. But I also think that they are, by many standards in our party, they are more moderate. They're not afraid to put up an NDAA. They are not afraid to talk about a robust foreign policy and funding a robust foreign policy. So I don't see a lot of concern with the new leadership. And I think like there was a poll that came out today in the Wall Street Journal that said it was conducted by the Ronald Reagan Foundation, an institute, and it said 57% of Americans support continuing our effort to fund this war, to help aid the Ukrainians. What was really interesting to me was 73% of Democrats in the crosstabs and 51% of Republicans. 10 years ago, you never would have seen numbers like that. And so when we talk about Senator-elect Vance, this shouldn't have to be explained to him. It's fine to we have bean counters for everything, and we should track everything. We should make sure our funding isn't wasted and misused. But this should not be a complicated issue for a United States senator to understand.
Yeah. But let me add on to that, because if I have one concern, it is going to be the politicization of this. And what I think back to is that in 2009, upon President Bush's departure, Georgia, which had bipartisan support, the Democrats turned on Georgia. It became a political issue. Saakashvili was a easy target, and the Democrats just decided we're not doing Georgia anymore. And I would go over to Tbilisi and talk to people, and it was, why do the Democrats hate us? And if you think about it, Georgia is now kind of a lost country. It's ruled by a crazy man who's not even elected anymore. The Russian footprint in Georgia is it's incredible. And with the fleeing of young Russian men, you now really feel like you're in Russia. It's not Georgia anymore. And I worry about for Ukraine that same thing, is the people. My point about the administration and Republican leadership have to go out there and make the case why Ukraine is important to the United States. You just have to do it.
This strikes for both of you, going back to what Barry had said just a few moments ago, how little the administration had reached out to Congress and briefed Congress and really kind of massaged the members. Maybe it was because it was election year, maybe because of economy was a distraction. But it seems to me you're both saying this is a time, this new Congress, this new political divide there is exactly when the administration is going to have to up its game. And I want to start with you, Barry, because you worked inside that West Wing during the very difficult years of Iraq and Afghanistan. What's going on in the West Wing right now? And Michael, what should be going on in the West Wing now in terms of the administration's leadership on Ukraine?
Yeah, I don't envy Jake Sullivan or Secretary Blinken at
Who
this
was up
point.
on the Hill yesterday, briefing everybody, just to be clear.
Yes, he should be every week. I remember, so after 9/11, President Bush had this very robust domestic agenda. But what changed in the West Wing was everybody understood, because he made it clear. The safety and security of our nation is now my 1, 2, 3, 10, 100th highest priority. That's it. And you didn't see it on the outside, Easter egg rolls and campaigning, all that was happening. But inside, it was all consuming. The difference was that we had men and women, boots on the ground.
Absolutely. It was our war.
It was
Both
our
of our
war.
wars.
This one, I understand and appreciate the administration's reluctance about getting us in that situation, especially after the debacle in Afghanistan. But they've got to find a way to make it real up on the Hill. And and I'm sure all summer and fall they were believing the same nonsense, that there was going to be a huge Republican wave, and they've been preparing for Republican control in Congress, which means, how do we get ready for oversight hearings? How do we figure out new friendships on the Republican side? How do we learn that cynicism is an art form up there, and so you just kind of be blind to it, and somebody can kneecap you one day, and the next day they're going to be your hero. And how do you live with that?
Yeah, Michael, Joe Biden is an experienced congressional hand, a career. He's had more than one career in Capitol Hill. What happens?
Well, the OLA, as Barry knows, sits in the East Wing. And all my friends in OLA would tell you, they would respectfully disagree with Barry that they did not pay enough attention to Capitol Hill. I would, no one's ever accused Joe Biden of not wanting to work with Republicans. In fact, I was with him the entire primary. And in fact, that's what his opponents in the primary were saying. The reason why he shouldn't be the nominee is because he's too willing to work with Republicans. And I've been asked this question a lot since the election. There will be no test for the president on whether he's willing to be bipartisan. The test, unfortunately, is going to be with the new speaker. Is he willing to work with this president? This president, you do not have to ask this president why the debt ceiling needs to be raised. You do have to ask Mr. McCarthy that. And it's the same thing on things like Ukraine. They are going to have to show that they are willing to work with the president. And Barry is correct. We've been preparing for huge majorities in the House and majority in the Senate. And I think, unfortunately or not, realistically, the president is not going to make many changes as a result of this past election, because it was, in terms of history, we haven't seen 40-year inflation, crime out of control, an unpopular incumbent. But regardless of the pain people were feeling, they don't trust that party. This became a referendum on the party out of power versus the party and the president in power for the first time that I can recall. And there is a lot of validation at the White House right now. They don't think they're doing everything right. Nothing's perfect, but that they don't view them as the ones that need to be tested right now.
In the 2 minutes we have left in our allotted time, I was surprised that we didn't hear more about back channel diplomatic efforts before the fighting actually started. What couldn't the world have done more to slow this down? Is diplomacy, obviously diplomacy is kind of in the hands of the Russians and the Russian government and obviously the Ukraine government. But could the United States, both the executive branch and the legislative branch, do more? Do you have any sense that they could or would do more to encourage a diplomatic element coming into this now?
No.
No.
Look, this is a challenge that's been going on since 2014. And it's up to the Ukrainians to decide if they're going to negotiate or not. And our job, is to be responsible friends and allies. We turned our back on both Georgia and Ukraine. We led them astray with this notion of, you're going to be in NATO, you're going to be in the EU. Well, the Europeans had no desire to have Georgia or Ukraine in the EU, and which then made NATO almost not possible. We're reaping what we sowed. And so the biggest mistake we can make is to somehow think we're going to pressure Ukrainians. And by the way, even my guess is, even if Zelensky decided he wants to do something like that, I don't think the Ukrainian people would stand for it. The ones that I know are like, okay, we've had it up to here with this Russia nonsense. We're not Russia. There was a Kyiv before there was a Moscow. The church is the Lavra. It's not cathedral spilt blood or whatever. So I don't think there's a path here unless the Ukrainian people decide there's a path.
And Michael, you get the last word. Agree with that?
I agree. I do. I agree 100% with the history, with the mistakes in 2014. I agree with that.
I thank you very much to these two excellent figures who know what they're talking about. I hope this has been helpful to you. Thank you very much for inviting us today. Thank you. Thank you so much for a very candid discussion.
I would really like to welcome you for another discussion sometime in the near future, because I'm sure there are a lot of questions and we're under a lot of pressure because of Senator Portman has to be here, right? All the logistics of Washington. Again, I found your comments very insightful, and there's a lot still that we should be discussing. So I hope that you'll come back again. Thank you again so very, very much.